About a month ago, I was working with the CEO of one of our newer clients. And in a conversation with him, one of the nicest guys that I've had the chance to meet in this work, it became clear to me that he had his head wrapped around the definitions of diversity and inclusion as they related to him personally. But he seemed to be struggling with creating the business case for diversity and inclusion within his organization. And so, although well-intended, he seemed hesitant and perhaps a little reticent to be a champion of the diversity and inclusion work within the organization, not because he didn't believe in it as, quote, the right thing to do, but that he struggled a bit with articulating why it was the best thing to do for his organization. And so in the conversation, as we were walking down to get a cup of coffee, I asked him if he fundamentally believed that engagement was a driver of performance. And he laughed and he said, well, of course, as most people would, and then talked about the millions he had just spent on engaging an engagement consulting firm to help them measure the extent to which employees within his organization were experiencing an environment that supported their highest level of engagement. And I asked him, was he surprised at the results? He said, no. He said, the engagement scores were quite high. And I said, so if you believe that engagement drives performance and you measure it, then you must have an engagement strategy for the organization. Then he stopped, as we were walking and thought a minute, and he kind of chuckled and said, well, the reality is, I think we hope that our employees will be engaged. We do things that should drive engagement, and we expect people to be engaged. But I think if you ask most managers and leaders in my company whether or not we had an engagement strategy, you might get a wide variety of differences, or no answer at all. And so, he sort of laughed, as we both did, that hope and expectations and the concept of should, none of those things are a strategy, and yet they're spending millions at measuring engagement with the hope and expectation that people will be engaged. And so I said, in my experience, in our experience as an organization, inclusion is the basis for an engagement strategy. So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's typically where we begin our conversation, which is a surprise to many people. We begin our conversation with, what does the organization need to do to assume responsibility and accountability for creating an environment that drives engagement, that increases the likelihood that most, if not more people, will contribute their best efforts every day. I think that one of the things that helps is to then say, well, is the organization willing to look at all of those things, all of those environmental aspects that might prevent people from contributing their best efforts, that might inhibit people's confidence. And so you have to think about, in most organizations, who's included in the inclusion strategy. For 20 years, we've been, probably more than that, we've been doing this work whereby we measure the extent to which people within an organization contribute their best work every day. And typically, in any variety of organizations, the percentage of people that contribute their best work every day is about 20%. It supports the 20-80 rule, essentially. And so the question is, why? Why do only 20% of people contribute that level of quality work? And is that acceptable simply because that seems to be the case in many organizations? And of course the answer is, why should it be acceptable? The reality is, and we believe, and data shows that most people are capable of increasing their contribution, and it requires an environment that engages them. With inclusion as engagement strategy, it then opens the door to talk about who isn't being engaged, who isn't being included. And in our experience, those individuals not being included are those that begin to fall outside of what the typical or traditional work group looks like. For example, in a technology firm we were working with years ago that merged with another technology firm, the people who were most included were the people who were technicians, not the people who were marketers. In financial services firms, historically, men were the predominant workforce and women were oftentimes not included. Historically, it depends on the field and the type of organization and the geographical. So the organization now can talk about diversity and the likelihood that the people who are most like the traditional workforce are oftentimes, most often, highly engaged. The people who represent differences in the workplace are oftentimes experiencing less engagement, or those factors that drive their personal engagement. Diversity becomes a more challenging conversation for some. And from a business perspective, it becomes a compliance issue. And make no mistakes, especially if you're in the US, you have a responsibility to pay attention to compliance in terms of workforce composition. But there are other aspects of diversity equally important, in fact more so if we're talking about a business case for diversity. The first thing is that if you look at your workforce composition, does it represent your best efforts in winning the war for talent? In other words, given that we are a global workforce, no matter where we are, based on the amount of people coming into the US, well-educated and prepared to do the best jobs, and you have a homogeneous population, is there data then that says that you've done your best work in getting the best and brightest people to work for you? In all likelihood, you haven't. In fact, in organizations that are all one dimension, whether that be race, ethnicity, gender, etc., the likelihood that they were able to attract the best and brightest from a global workforce is small. So first of all, take a snapshot, and is your organization representing its best efforts in getting the best talent? The second piece is that diversity, when present, can create conflict. By nature, it should. But in the absence of an inclusion strategy, the conflict goes unchecked and becomes dysfunction. What we look for in organizations is to ensure that diversity is present, and in combination with inclusion, create a diverse by design philosophy or point of view, that diversity, when managed well, allows for conflict to become innovation. And the last piece is a little bit more remote for some people to understand, but think about it this way. If I worked for an organization and I represented some level of diversity, and I looked at the top level of the organization and I didn't see anyone that looked like me. And what I mean by look at is broadly defined, represented my differences. So maybe, if you think about it fundamentally, maybe there are no women at the top of the organization, but even more broadly, maybe there are people that have a certain pedigree of education, a certain way of thinking, certain mannerisms, certain ways of dressing, and all those individuals look the same, but I don't see me there. I don't see someone who represents my differences there. The data would say people like me are unlikely to be successful here, because there's no data that says that people like me can be. And so the purpose of having representation, especially at senior levels, also supports the building of confidence in more people, that in fact, all or more people than the traditional work group can be successful here as well. And so now you can see that when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, which mistakenly is oftentimes referred to as D&I, that inclusion as a verb, the act of including with the intention to engage, is something that can be leveraged and an expectation for everyone in the organization. Diversity, also measured in terms of compliance, representation, retention, etc., should also be supported by all in the organization. There may be less of an opportunity, especially if an organization isn't hiring, but the two always have to be in balance. One of the things that we've learned over the years is that diverse organizations aren't necessarily inclusive. Inclusive organizations aren't necessarily diverse. Diversity alone, in fact, isn't necessarily a driver of organizational performance. It's only when diversity and inclusion are combined that the organization can create a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And so think about it this way. If you're a diverse organization but not inclusive, then you might experience decreased morale, turnover, perhaps some litigation. If you're an inclusive organization but not very diverse, then you might experience decreased innovation and increased groupthink. So if you're going to be focusing on diversity in terms of workforce composition and representation, you must have a corresponding inclusion strategy. And Conversely, if you are focusing on inclusion, you make sure you're doing a great job at driving diversity. The two must always be in balance in order for an organization to be successful. So I guess the bottom line in summary is for us, when we're asked about what are the winning aspects of a diversity and inclusion initiative within any given company, it's the achievement of that balance over a period of time, driven by two distinct initiatives, one around diversity and workforce composition, the other one around inclusion and engagement. The messaging of that so that everyone is crystal clear about what their roles are in both of those initiatives, and the role of leadership in modeling all of the key behaviors that support both of those as well. And I think that seems to be the key underlying themes of a successful initiative. I hope this has been helpful. It's a way that we think about diversity and inclusion that differentiates Global Innovations from others in our market.